All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Next Time in Power. So I'm going to make a video about the Arnold Schwarzenegger and Frank Zane rivalry. Now, I think this is one of the most fascinating rivalries in bodybuilding history because it's a clear example of size versus conditioning, and the fact that Arnold was nearly 40 to 50 pounds heavier than Frank Zane on stage, but there was still an occasion where Frank Zane would defeat Arnold Schwarzenegger. So one of the points I wanted to get to in this video is when a lot of people think of Arnold's famous rivalries, they tend to think of Arnold versus Sergio Oliva, or maybe even Arnold versus Lou Ferrigno as seen in Pumping Iron. But the interesting thing here is Arnold versus Frank Zane actually predates his rivalry with both Lou Ferrigno and Sergio Oliva, and also post-dates the rivalry with Sergio and the rivalry with Lou. So Frank Zane's bodybuilding career actually goes a little bit further back than Arnold Schwarzenegger's. Frank Zane was competing starting in 1961, with his first show ever being the Mr. Pennsylvania competition, and Arnold Schwarzenegger would start competing about 4 years later in 1965. Now, throughout the 60s, Frank Zane was able to obtain a title that Arnold Schwarzenegger was never able to obtain, and that would be the Mr. America title. So Frank Zane would win that title 3 times in the 1960s, specifically the IFBB Mr. America and not the AAU Mr. America. He would win that in 1966, 1967, and again in 1968. So the year 1968 would bring us to the year that the rivalry between Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger started. Now again, Arnold would not appear at his first Mr. Olympia competition until 1969, so this actually predates any of Arnold's Olympia wins and any of his Olympia rivalries, which would include Lou Ferrigno and Sergio Oliva. Now at this point in time, Arnold had only been beaten once on a bodybuilding stage. Now history will show that Arnold has only been beaten 3 times total on a bodybuilding stage. Now the 1968 IFBB Mr. Universe would be one of those times. So in 1968, Arnold and Frank Zane would go head-to-head. Arnold was much bigger than Frank Zane, much fuller, much rounder, and again, just much bigger overall. But Frank Zane was so much more conditioned than Arnold that despite being much smaller than him, he defeated Arnold, and Arnold was expecting, obviously, to win this Mr. Universe. So this really sent Arnold back to the drawing board, and it put Frank Zane on the map for beating this guy that was significantly bigger than him. And it really started the trend and set the bar higher for guys like Arnold. Okay, if we're going to win shows, we've got to have better conditioning. Clearly, conditioning is something they're looking for. This Frank Zane guy is beating guys that are significantly bigger than him because his conditioning is so crazy. So it really set the bar higher for Arnold. And then when he would make his first Olympia appearance in '69 and then into the 1970s, he would have much better conditioning than the conditioning that you would see from him throughout the '60s. So in my opinion, losing to Frank Zane actually made Arnold a much better bodybuilder because after that defeat, you actually really never saw Arnold come in with conditioning that was off. From that point forward, he had actually looked pretty well conditioned at every Olympia appearance he would make. And of course, the following year, Arnold would finally nab that IFBB Mr. Universe win in New York in 1969. And that same year, he would also win the NABA Mr. Universe over in London. And then in 1969, Arnold would compete in his first Olympia, taking second to Sergio Oliva. Then in 1970, that would be the beginning of the reign of Arnold Schwarzenegger, which would last 6 years. Then, of course, he would come back in 1980, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because that's where the rivalry between him and Frank Zane culminated, was at that 1980 Mr. Olympia. So as I mentioned before, Arnold would start competing in the Olympia in 1969, and he would compete through 1975. And Frank Zane would begin competing at the Olympia in 1972. So despite the fact they were competing at the Olympia at the same time, the really fascinating thing here is that the two of them would actually never go head-to-head on the Olympia stage during that entire time from 70 to 75 where Arnold was competing, because at this point in 1972, when Frank Zane finally came over to the Olympia, they had implemented the over 200 and under 200 categories at the Olympia. So what this meant was everybody under 200 pounds would compete, and then there would be a winner of that division. Everybody over 200 pounds would compete. There'd be a winner of that division. And the winners of the both divisions, the over and under, they would go head-to-head for the overall Mr. Olympia title. So from 1972 to 1976, Frank Zane actually never won the over 200 division, so he never had the opportunity to go head-to-head with one of the over 200 guys like Arnold. So even though they competed the same years, they didn't compete against each other those same years. So Arnold would retire in 1975, and then Frank Zane would go on to place second at the 1976 Mr. Olympia in the under 200. Then from 1977 to 1979, he would win both the under 200 and the overall Mr. Olympia titles for 3 years in a row, going into the 1980 Mr. Olympia. So the 1980 Mr. Olympia will probably go down in history as one of the most controversial Mr. Olympias ever. If you guys want to see a more in-depth video on that, I've done a video on it called The Most Controversial Olympia, and it's got close to 1 million views. So go check that out if you want to see more information about the 1980 Mr. Olympia. So in 1980, this would be the first time since 1968 that Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger would go head-to-head. So it had been 12 years since these two guys were compared against each other on stage, since that 1968 Mr. Universe competition. But many people expected the competition was going to be very, very close between Arnold and Frank Zane, because obviously Arnold was away in Hollywood while Frank Zane was busy winning 3 Mr. Olympia titles. So many people thought this was kind of a shoo-in for Frank Zane to win his 4th Mr. Olympia. But unfortunately, Frank Zane would have to recover from a life-threatening injury while training for this Olympia. But on the same token, Arnold Schwarzenegger would only train for this Mr. Olympia for 8 weeks. So not only did Arnold Schwarzenegger win the 1980 Mr. Olympia, but Frank Zane would not take second, but he would take third. So Chris Dickerson actually beat Frank Zane. Arnold Schwarzenegger beat Chris Dickerson. So the 3-time Mr. Olympia going into the 1980 Olympia not only lost his title, but he moved all the way down to third, despite the fact that he still looked pretty good. So Frank Zane was actually so upset about this decision, he actually was said to have thrown his trophy against the wall backstage and broke it. And him and several other bodybuilders boycotted the following year's Mr. Olympia and did not attend and did not compete. So in 1981, you would not see Frank Zane, you would not see Boyer Coe, you would not see Mike Menser, and that would be the year Franco Columbu came back and won his own Mr. Olympia. So really over the course of a 12-year rivalry, there was only 2 competitions where they actually went head-to-head. In 1968, Frank Zane took the win of the Mr. Universe, and in 1980, Arnold Schwarzenegger took the win of the Mr. Olympia. So I'm going to leave the voting up to you guys. Which do you prefer, Frank Zane or Arnold Schwarzenegger, since they were kind of tied, 1 Mr. Universe versus 1 Mr. Olympia? So which physique do you guys prefer? Which bodybuilder do you guys prefer? Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.